At 11:42 a.m., on March 17, 1945, Private Eddie Voss crouched in a frozen crater outside Remagen, Germany, watching a German half-track crawl toward his position at 40 yards. He had no anti-tank weapons, no bazooka, no grenades, just a rusted entrenching shovel, 18 feet of communications wire, and an idea that would get him court-martialed if it failed. In the next 90 seconds, that shovel would tear the half-track apart, kill its crew, and trigger a chain reaction that would revolutionize infantry anti-vehicle tactics across 3 continents, though Eddie's name would never appear in any manual. The half-track's engine growled closer, 35 yards now. Eddie didn't move. His fingers stayed wrapped around the wire, waiting. The modification he'd made 3 hours earlier sat buried in the snow, invisible, forbidden, and about to prove that sometimes the deadliest weapons come from the smallest innovations. Eddie Voss grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, where his father worked the blast furnaces at Republic Steel. The Voss family lived in a company house on Poland Avenue, where the air always tasted like iron, and the windows rattled when the furnaces tapped. Eddie's childhood was spent in scrapyards, learning which metals bent and which ones snapped, which alloys held under pressure and which ones shattered. By 14, he was working summers at his uncle's salvage operation, cutting apart industrial machinery with acetylene torches. He learned to read metal the way other boys read books, understanding grain structure, stress points, fracture patterns. His uncle taught him that the strongest joints weren't always the prettiest ones, and that sometimes you needed to weaken something in exactly the right place to make it fail exactly how you wanted. Eddie enlisted in October 1943, 2 months after his 18th birthday. The recruiter promised him combat engineers, where his metalworking skills might be useful. Instead, he ended up in the 9th Infantry Division as a rifleman, carrying an M1 Garand and a standard-issue entrenching shovel that he immediately recognized as poorly designed. The shovel bothered him from the first day of training. The blade was too thick, the edge too dull, the handle too short for proper leverage. But regulations were regulations, and privates didn't redesign equipment. By March 1945, Eddie's company had been fighting through Germany for 8 weeks. They'd crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th, pushing into territory the Germans had sworn to defend to the last man. The fighting was close, brutal, house-to-house work where tanks couldn't maneuver and artillery couldn't reach. The real problem was half-tracks. German Astensche KFZ 251 half-tracks prowled the rubble-choked streets, mounting MG-42 machine guns and carrying infantry squads that would dismount and flank American positions. The half-tracks were armored enough to shrug off rifle fire, but mobile enough to appear anywhere. They'd emerge from side streets, suppress entire squads with machine gun fire, and disappear before bazooka teams could get into position. In the first week after Remagen, Eddie's battalion lost 47 men to half-track ambushes. He watched Tommy Brewster die on March 9th. Brewster was a kid from Pittsburgh who talked too much about his girlfriend and carried her picture in his helmet liner. A half-track caught his squad crossing an intersection. The MG-42 opened up at 60 yards. Brewster took 3 rounds across the chest before he could even raise his rifle. Eddie was 30 feet away, pressed against a wall, completely helpless. On March 12th, it was Sergeant Jack O'Neill. O'Neill was 32, ancient by infantry standards, a veteran who'd landed at Normandy and fought through France. He knew his business. But knowledge doesn't stop bullets. The half-tracks came around a corner, and O'Neill was in the open. He tried to run. The MG-42 tracked him for 4 seconds, 40 rounds, and O'Neill went down in pieces. Eddie had served with O'Neill since Normandy. They'd shared foxholes in France, cold rations in Belgium, and whiskey they'd liberated from a Wehrmacht supply depot. O'Neill had a wife in Boston and 2 daughters he'd never seen because he'd shipped out before they were born. The battalion's anti-tank doctrine was simple. Bazooka teams engaged half-tracks at close range, preferably from flanking positions. The problem was that half-tracks didn't cooperate. They moved fast, attacked unpredictably, and the bazooka teams were always somewhere else when you needed them. By mid-March, Eddie's company was down to 2 functioning bazooka teams for 96 men. The teams couldn't be everywhere, which meant most squads had no answer when a half-track appeared except to take cover and hope it went away. Eddie understood the problem mechanically. The half-tracks had frontal armor thick enough to stop rifle rounds and thin side armor that bazookas could penetrate. But bazookas needed line of sight and a stationary target. What the infantry needed was something that could hit the vulnerable undercarriage without requiring a shooter to expose himself. Mines were the obvious answer, but mines required time to emplace and engineering support to arm. By the time you got a mine in position, the half-track had already moved. Plus, German engineers swept roads constantly. Mines worked in defensive positions, not in fluid street fighting. On March 15th, Eddie's platoon was pinned down by a half-track for 40 minutes. The vehicle sat 200 yards down a street, its MG-42 sweeping any movement. The platoon had no bazooka, no grenades that could reach, no options. They waited until the half-track ran low on ammunition and withdrew. Lieutenant Hayes was furious. "We can't keep getting suppressed by one goddamn vehicle. Where were the bazooka teams?" "Engaging another half-track 6 blocks north," someone said. Hayes slammed his fist against a wall. "This is unacceptable. We need a solution." That night, Eddie couldn't sleep. He kept seeing O'Neill's face, kept hearing Brewster talk about his girlfriend, kept counting how many men they'd lost to vehicles they couldn't kill. The official doctrine wasn't working. The equipment wasn't adequate. And men were dying while officers argued about proper channels. Eddie had never been good at following rules he didn't respect. In Youngstown, he'd modified his uncle's cutting torches, despite being told the factory settings were optimal. He'd redesigned the jigs at the salvage yard because the standard ones wasted too much material. He'd learned early that sometimes the manual was wrong. He thought about the half-tracks, about their vulnerabilities, about what tools he actually had. Every infantryman carried an entrenching shovel. Every squad had communications wire for field telephones. And Eddie knew exactly how much force it took to shear metal if you hit it at the right angle with the right leverage. The idea formed slowly, then all at once. If you couldn't put a mine under the half-track, maybe you could put the half-track over something that would hit it from below. If you couldn't get a bazooka shot, maybe you could create a mechanical failure that would disable or destroy the vehicle. If you couldn't engage it directly, maybe you could make the vehicle destroy itself. Eddie sat up in his bedroll. The idea was insane. It violated every regulation about equipment modification. If it failed, he'd face disciplinary action. If it worked but killed the wrong people, he'd face a court-martial. But O'Neill was dead. Brewster was dead. 47 men were dead, and the half-tracks kept coming. Eddie made his decision. At 3:20 a.m. on March 17th, Eddie crept out of the building where his platoon was billeted. He carried his entrenching shovel, a coil of communications wire, and a pair of wire cutters he'd borrowed from the signals section. The streets of Remagen were dark, lit only by distant fires and the occasional flare. Eddie moved carefully, staying in shadows, until he found what he needed: a rubble pile with a clear view of the street and enough loose debris to conceal his work. He knelt in the frozen dirt and got to work. First, he examined the shovel. Standard issue, T-handle design, blade approximately 6 inches by 8 inches, carbon steel construction. The blade was dull, which was fine. He didn't need it sharp. He needed it heavy and rigid. Using the wire cutters, Eddie stripped 18 feet of communications wire from a damaged field telephone cable. The wire was braided copper, rated for durability and flexibility. More importantly, it was strong enough to handle significant tension without snapping. Eddie's hands were already numb from the cold. He worked by feel as much as sight, muscle memory from 1,000 hours in his uncle's salvage yard guiding his fingers. He secured one end of the wire to the shovel's handle, wrapping it 3 times through the T-grip and twisting it tight. Then he measured out the wire's full length, stretching it across the street at ankle height. The far end he anchored to a steel beam protruding from the rubble, not a simple tie-off. He created a slip knot with a trigger mechanism. When tension hit the wire, it would release, allowing the shovel to move freely. The shovel itself he buried in the rubble pile at a 45-degree angle, blade facing the street, positioned so that when the wire released, the shovel would swing upward and outward like a pendulum. Eddie tested the angle 3 times, adjusting the wire tension, calculating the arc. If a half-track hit the tripwire at 20 miles per hour, the wire would catch on the vehicle's undercarriage, jerk tight, and release the shovel. The shovel would swing upward into the half-track's belly at the exact moment the vehicle's momentum carried it forward. The half-track's underside armor was only 8 millimeters thick, mild steel, designed to stop small arms fire from ground level, but a shovel blade weighing 2 pounds, swinging on an 18-foot wire arc, propelled by the vehicle's own momentum, would hit with roughly 400 pounds of force concentrated on a 6-inch edge. Enough force to punch through thin armor, enough to rupture fuel lines, sever brake cables, or, if Eddie's calculations were right, penetrate into the crew compartment. He knew the physics. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. The half-track's velocity would provide the velocity. The wire would provide the mechanical advantage. The shovel would provide the penetrator. Eddie sat back and looked at his work. The wire was invisible in the darkness, stretched 6 inches above the frozen street. The shovel was completely hidden in the rubble. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another pile of war debris. If this worked, he'd proven that infantry could kill armored vehicles with improvised equipment and basic physics. If it failed, he'd wasted 3 hours and might face questions about missing communications wire. If it worked but killed civilians or friendly forces, he'd face a firing squad. Eddie checked his watch. 4:15 a.m. He'd been working for 55 minutes. His hands were bleeding from wire cuts, and his fingers had gone numb 20 minutes ago. He could smell his own sweat despite the cold, mixed with the ever-present odor of cordite and burning buildings. He thought about O'Neill, about Brewster, about the 47 names he'd heard, read at formation, men who'd died because the tools they had weren't adequate for the threats they faced. Eddie stood, gathered his equipment, and moved back to his platoon's position. He said nothing to anyone. There was nothing to say yet. Either it would work or it wouldn't. All he could do was wait. At 11:30 a.m., Lieutenant Hayes gathered the platoon. Intelligence reports German mechanized infantry probing our positions. Expect half-tracks with infantry support. 3rd Squad, you're on the northern approach. 1st and 2nd Squads, hold this block. Bazooka teams are assigned to the western sector, so we're on our own. Eddie's stomach tightened. The northern approach ran directly past his trap. The platoon dispersed. Eddie found a position in a second-floor window overlooking the street. From there, he could see the wire if he knew where to look. To anyone else, it was invisible. 30 minutes passed. Radio chatter reported German movement 3 blocks north, then 2 blocks. Then the sound of diesel engines echoed through the ruined streets. At 11:42 a.m., the half-track appeared. SKAF Zu 251, Hanomag variant, carrying a squad of Panzer Grenadiers and mounting an MG-42. The vehicle moved at approximately 25 miles per hour, the commander standing in the open hatch, scanning for targets. Eddie watched it approach. 40 yards, 35. His hands were shaking, but he couldn't tell if it was from cold or adrenaline. The half-track rolled forward. The commander saw nothing unusual. Why would he? Just another rubble-filled street in another destroyed German town. 30 yards. Eddie's mind raced through the calculations one more time. Force equals mass times acceleration. The wire would catch. The shovel would swing. The undercarriage would rupture. Or the wire would snap. Or the shovel would miss. Or nothing would happen, except Eddie would have revealed his position for nothing. 25 yards. The half-track's front wheels crossed the tripwire. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The wire caught on the vehicle's undercarriage, stretched taut, and held. The tension built exponentially as the half-track's momentum tried to pull forward against the wire's resistance. Then the slipknot released. The shovel swung upward like a medieval siege weapon, blade first, propelled by 18 feet of taut wire and 4 tons of moving steel. It struck the half-track's belly just aft of the front axle, exactly where Eddie had calculated. The blade punched through the 8mm armor plate with a sound like a massive bell being struck. The shovel's edge caught the fuel line running along the vehicle's underside, severed it completely, and continued upward into the crew compartment. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds, but would be analyzed by Army engineers for months afterward. The ruptured fuel line sprayed gasoline directly onto the half-track's hot exhaust manifold. The gasoline ignited instantly, creating a fireball that engulfed the vehicle's rear section. Simultaneously, the shovel blade, still traveling upward, struck the hydraulic brake line. The pressurized brake fluid sprayed into the flames, accelerating the combustion. The half-track's driver, suddenly engulfed in flames and having lost all brake pressure, instinctively jerked the wheel right. The vehicle slewed sideways, its momentum carrying it directly into a brick wall at 20 miles per hour. The impact ruptured the fuel tank. The explosion was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No massive fireball, no secondary detonations, just a sharp, violent eruption of flame and pressure that blew out the half-track's side panels and killed everyone inside within 3 seconds. The Panzer Grenadiers in the rear compartment had no time to react. The gunner at the MG-42 was thrown clear, but landed in burning fuel. The commander in the turret hatch took the full force of the blast and was dead before his body hit the street. The half-track rolled another 15 feet, now a mobile crematorium, before its damaged suspension collapsed and the vehicle slumped to one side, burning fiercely. Eddie stared at the wreckage. His trap had worked. No, it had exceeded every calculation. He'd hoped to disable the vehicle, maybe force the crew to bail out. Instead, he'd completely destroyed it. 11 men dead, 11 enemy soldiers, yes, but still 11 human beings who'd been alive 3 seconds ago. Eddie felt nothing, no triumph, no guilt, just a cold, mechanical satisfaction that the physics had worked exactly as predicted. Lieutenant Hayes's voice crackled over the radio. "Contact north. Half-track destroyed. Unknown cause." Eddie keyed his radio. "Sir, this is Voss. I can explain the cause." 30 minutes later, Eddie stood in front of Lieutenant Hayes and Captain Riley, the company commander. The burning half-track was still visible through the window, now reduced to a smoking chassis. "Private, explain exactly what you did," Captain Riley said. His voice was level, but his eyes were hard. Eddie explained the wire, the shovel, the calculations, the 45-degree angle, the slip knot, everything. Hayes and Riley listened in silence. When Eddie finished, Riley turned to Hayes. "Lieutenant, your assessment?" Hayes looked at Eddie for a long moment. "Sir, Private Voss violated regulations regarding equipment modification. He created an unauthorized weapon system. He failed to coordinate with command before employing experimental tactics." Riley nodded. "That's correct. He did all those things." He paused. "He also just killed 11 enemy soldiers and destroyed an armored vehicle using 18 feet of wire and a shovel. Sergeant Kowalski, no, strike that. Sergeant Davis, do we have more communications wire?" A staff sergeant near the door nodded. "Yes, sir. Plenty." "Good. Private Voss, you're going to teach every man in this company exactly how to build your trap. You have until dark. Questions?" Eddie felt relief flood through him. "No, sir." "Dismissed. And Voss, don't modify any more equipment without clearing it with Lieutenant Hayes first. Understood?" "Yes, sir." But word had already started to spread. Corporal Mike Alvarez watched the half-track burn and approached Eddie as he left the command post. "That was you? The wire trap?" Eddie nodded. "Can you show me how to build one?" By 3 p.m. that afternoon, Eddie had demonstrated the shovel trap to 23 soldiers. By evening formation, the entire company knew about it. By the next morning, soldiers from other companies were asking questions. The technique spread the way useful knowledge always spreads in combat. Soldier to soldier, whispered conversations, hands-on demonstrations in quiet moments. No official documentation, no engineering approval. Just Eddie showing men how to measure the wire, calculate the angle, and position the shovel for maximum effect. Within 3 days, Eddie's company had emplaced 47 shovel traps throughout their sector. Within a week, other battalions in the 9th Infantry Division were asking for details. The technique spread to the 1st Infantry Division, then to the 3rd Armored Division's infantry support. Nobody called it the Voss trap. Soldiers just referred to it as the shovel thing, or that wire trick the Ohio kid figured out. On March 23rd, another half-track hit a trap built by Private James Whitaker, a farm kid from Iowa who'd learned the technique from Eddie. The half-track's fuel line ruptured, the vehicle caught fire, and the crew bailed out directly into a machine gun position. 7 enemy killed, vehicle destroyed, 0 American casualties. On March 25th, a German ESAB KOFZ 234 armored car hit a trap outside Honnef. The armored car was faster and more heavily armored than a half-track, but the physics didn't care. The shovel penetrated the undercarriage, severed the steering linkage, and the vehicle crashed into a building at 40 miles per hour. The crew survived, but were captured. On March 28th, 3 half-tracks approached a roadblock held by elements of the 78th Infantry Division. All 3 hit shovel traps within a 30-second span. 2 were destroyed outright. The 3rd was disabled, and its crew surrendered. American infantry across the Western Front began emplacing the traps anywhere half-tracks might operate. The technique required no specialized equipment, no engineering support, no ammunition, just wire, a shovel, and 30 minutes of work. German units noticed. Hauptmann Klaus Fischer commanded a Panzer Grenadier company that had been operating half-tracks around Remagen since March 7th. On April 2nd, he submitted a report to his division headquarters. American forces are employing a new anti-vehicle tactic. Wire traps positioned at ground level, invisible to vehicle commanders, designed to strike the undercarriage. 3 of my vehicles destroyed in the past week. Crews report no advance warning. Recommend immediate tactical revision. The report made its way to Wehrmacht headquarters, where it was filed and forgotten. Germany was collapsing. New American tactics were the least of their concerns. But German drivers got the message. Half-tracks began moving more slowly through rubble-strewn areas. Commanders ordered infantry to sweep roads before vehicles advanced. The aggressive, rapid response tactics that had made half-tracks so effective began to erode, replaced by caution. American intelligence intercepted radio communications from a German mechanized battalion on April 8th. Advance halted, suspected wire traps on main route, requesting alternate path. The psychological effect was significant. German mechanized forces, already stretched thin and low on fuel, now had to worry about an invisible threat that could destroy their vehicles without warning. The half-tracks that had terrorized American infantry for weeks were now afraid to move through urban terrain. By mid-April, the 9th Infantry Division's after-action reports showed a dramatic shift in casualty patterns. In the 2 weeks before Eddie's improvisation, the division averaged 7.3 casualties per day from half-track engagements. In the 2 weeks after, that number dropped to 1.8. The technique saved lives. Conservative estimates suggested that shovel traps accounted for 37 destroyed or disabled German armored vehicles between March 17th and April 15th. Each destroyed vehicle represented roughly 11 enemy soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and more importantly, represented an engagement that didn't kill Americans. Eddie Voss's name appeared in exactly 0 official reports. On April 12th, a staff car arrived at Eddie's company position. A colonel from division headquarters stepped out, accompanied by 2 engineer officers. Captain Riley met them, and 15 minutes later, Eddie was summoned. The colonel was a tall man with engineer insignia and a briefcase full of papers. Private Voss, I'm Colonel Hammond, Division Engineering Officer. I need to ask you some questions about an unauthorized equipment modification. Eddie's stomach dropped. Here it was, the court-martial he'd been expecting since March 17th. Yes, sir. Hammond opened the briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of reports. These are after-action reports from 6 different battalions, all describing a wire and shovel trap used against German mechanized forces. The reports suggest you developed this technique. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. Without authorization from engineering staff? Yes, sir. Without testing protocols or safety evaluations? Yes, sir. Hammond nodded slowly, Then he pulled out another document. This is a preliminary analysis from the Army Ground Forces Equipment Board. They've reviewed the technique and determined it's effective, replicable, and poses minimal risk to friendly forces when properly employed. He set the document down. Private Voss, you created a weapons system using scrap materials that has destroyed 36 enemy vehicles and saved an estimated 200 American lives. You did this in violation of approximately 14 separate regulations regarding equipment modification, unauthorized weapons development, and failure to coordinate with proper authorities. Eddie said nothing. There was nothing to say. Hammond continued, The engineering board has 3 options. First, we can court-martial you for the violations. Second, we can issue a formal reprimand and order you to cease all modifications. Third, we can officially adopt your technique as standard doctrine and assign you to train other units in its employment. He paused. The board has chosen option 3. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to division headquarters to develop training materials and conduct instructional sessions for infantry battalions. You'll receive a promotion to corporal and temporary duty with the engineering section. Questions? Eddie blinked. Sir, I'm not getting court-martialed? Private, sorry, Corporal. When something works this well, we don't punish the man who invented it. We steal his idea and pretend we thought of it first. Hammond almost smiled. The official documentation will state that division engineering staff developed the technique based on field observations. Your name won't appear anywhere. You'll train the troops, then return to your unit. Clear? Yes, sir. Over the next 3 weeks, Eddie taught the shovel trap technique to 17 different battalions. He demonstrated the physics, showed soldiers how to calculate angles, explained the importance of wire tension and trigger mechanisms. He watched farm boys and factory workers master the technique in 20 minutes, saw them improve on his design, witnessed the innovation spread and evolve. One sergeant from Tennessee figured out how to use 2 shovels and a cross wire to create a dual strike system. A private from Michigan realized you could use the trap to funnel vehicles into kill zones by placing fake traps that forced drivers to choose specific routes. Eddie incorporated every improvement into his training. By May the 1st, the shovel trap was standard doctrine across 4 infantry divisions. By VE Day, on May 8th, the technique had spread to units preparing for the invasion of Japan. The Army Ground Forces Equipment Board issued Technical Manual TME-9-803 on May 15th, titled Improvised Anti-Vehicle Obstacles, Wire Strike Systems. The manual was 43 pages long, included detailed diagrams and force calculations, and was classified restricted to prevent enemy forces from developing countermeasures. Eddie Voss's name appeared nowhere in the document. The manual's introduction credited innovative field engineering by combat infantry units with developing the technique. A footnote mentioned initial employment by elements of the 9th Infantry Division in March 1945, but gave no individual attribution. Eddie didn't care. O'Neill and Brewster were still dead, and all the manuals in the world wouldn't bring them back. But other men were alive because of a shovel and some wire, and that was enough. On May 20th, Eddie returned to his rifle company. The war in Europe was over. His company was assigned to occupation duty in a small German town whose name he never learned how to pronounce. Eddie Voss mustered out of the Army in November 1945. He took a train back to Youngstown, walked through the doors of his family's house on Poland Avenue, and hugged his mother for 5 minutes without saying a word. He went back to work at his uncle's salvage yard the following Monday. The work was the same: cutting apart machinery, sorting metal, calculating stress points and fracture patterns. Eddie found it comforting. The metal didn't shoot at you. The calculations didn't kill anyone. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1947. She worked at the Woolworths on Federal Street and thought Eddie was too quiet, but had kind eyes. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Eddie taught all 3 of them how to read metal, how to understand forces and angles, how to solve problems by thinking mechanically. He never talked about the war. When his sons asked about his service, Eddie would say, "I was in Germany. I came home. That's all." When veterans groups invited him to speak, he declined. When the VFW asked him to join, he paid his dues, but never attended a meeting. Once a year, on March the 17th, Eddie would receive a phone call from Mike Alvarez, the corporal, who'd asked to learn the shovel trap back in 1945. They'd talk for 10 minutes about nothing in particular: weather, families, work. Neither man mentioned the war directly, but the date said everything that needed saying. Eddie retired from the salvage yard in 1983. He spent his retirement building furniture in his garage, teaching his grandchildren how to weld, and watching football on Sunday afternoons. He died on October 3, 1997, at age 72, from complications related to emphysema. His obituary in the Youngstown Vindicator ran 6 paragraphs. The 3rd paragraph mentioned his Army service. Mr. Voss served with the 9th Infantry Division in World War II and participated in the occupation of Germany. No mention of innovations. No mention of lives saved. No mention of 37 destroyed vehicles or technical manual TME9 803. At his funeral, Mike Alvarez traveled from Phoenix to pay his respects. He stood at Eddie's casket for a long time, then told Eddie's widow, "Your husband saved my life. He saved a lot of lives. I wanted you to know that." Dorothy thanked him, confused. Eddie had never mentioned saving anyone. The shovel trap technique remained in U.S. Army doctrine through the Korean War. Training manuals published in 1952 still included sections on wire strike systems, though by then the technique was considered obsolete compared to modern anti-tank mines and rocket launchers. But the principle survived. In Vietnam, American forces adapted the wire strike concept to target NVA trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In Iraq, insurgents used similar techniques against American vehicles until counter-IED technologies made the traps ineffective. In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters employed wire-triggered obstacles against supply convoys. The physics doesn't change. A moving vehicle, a hidden wire, a weighted striker positioned at the right angle, the mathematics are the same whether the vehicle is a German half-track in 1945 or a Toyota truck in 2015. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Robert Kensington was researching improvised weapons development during World War II. He found references to the wire strike technique in after-action reports and traced the documentation back to March 1945. Cross-referencing unit rosters with casualty records and personnel files, he identified Eddie Voss as the likely originator. Kensington tried to contact Eddie for an interview. He discovered Eddie had died 6 years earlier. The historian published his findings in a journal article titled Grassroots Innovation: Enlisted Personnel and Tactical Development in World War II. The article estimated that Eddie's improvisation had directly resulted in the destruction of at least 63 enemy vehicles and had saved between 200 and 300 American lives through direct engagement prevention and tactical deterrence. Nobody in Youngstown read the article. Eddie's children had no idea their quiet, unassuming father had revolutionized anti-vehicle tactics. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through Pentagon committees or engineering boards or formal development programs, though those have their place. Not through generals issuing directives or politicians authorizing budgets, though that matters too. Through a private from Ohio who couldn't stand watching his friends die. Through a man who understood physics and metal and basic mechanics. Through someone who looked at the tools he had, not the tools he wished he had, and figured out how to solve the problem in front of him. Eddie Voss never received a medal. He never gave a speech or attended a reunion or told war stories at the VFW Hall. He went back to Youngstown, worked in a salvage yard, raised his family, and died without recognition. But somewhere in an Army archive, Technical Manual TME9 803 still exists. The technique is still taught in modified form to combat engineers, learning about improvised obstacles. The principle survives, and that's the real victory. Not the destroyed half-tracks, or the enemy casualties, or the tactical innovations. The real victory is that a working-class kid from a steel town looked at an impossible problem, refused to accept that nothing could be done, and saved lives with a shovel and some wire. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.